Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateacherhistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateacherfist, or shoot me an email, chris@ateacherhistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that a marriage between one of Andrew Jackson's good friends and a local bartender ended up becoming one of the biggest scandals of Andrew Jackson's presidency? And that when it was all said and done, Andrew Jackson had an entirely new cabinet and a new vice president. And more than anything else, this experience that we will talk about today in episode 121 shows that Andrew Jackson, if nothing else, was always up for a fight. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 121, Extra Credit, the Petticoat Affair. All right, everyone, welcome in to another episode of A Teacher's History of the United States. I am very excited today. I am being joined by a fellow American history podcaster, Daniel Galata, the host of the Age of Jackson podcast, a podcast that I am a huge fan of, and I would highly recommend that you check out. If you like this podcast, you will like his. And so, Daniel, why don't you take a moment, introduce yourself, where we can find you and follow you, and why you wanted to hop on to this podcast to talk about the Petticoat Affair.
Well, thank you for having me on, Chris. It's delightful to be here. Big fan of the podcast myself. So everything we can do to get history into the earbuds of more people is something we can all support. So thank you very much for having me on. To blush and talk about myself, I'm a PhD candidate in American religious history at Stanford University. But prior to that, I was at Yale University doing my master's degree, also in American religious history there. And prior to that, I come from the land down under. I'm Australian, if you can't tell by my accent, although I became an American citizen in September last year. So, dual citizen.
Congrats.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful to be a part of this great republic. I'm fascinated with religion, and I'm fascinated with Andrew Jackson. And one of the things that brings those two together, there's many things that bring those two subjects together, which is what my thesis is about. But this episode in particular, the Eaton Affair or the Petticoat Affair, this incident in Jackson's White House, one of the interesting elements is the religious element. So I'm fascinated to talk about all the players, all the angles, sex in the White House, sex scandals in the presidency. We attribute that type of stuff to, the Kennedys, the Clintons, our current president, Mr. Trump. But sorry, kids, it goes all the way back to the antebellum period to find these kind of scandals as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They just weren't as talked about as publicly as they likely are today. So thinking about before we started recording, we talked about sort of how to introduce this. So I left off in my last episode introducing President Andrew Jackson, talking about the spoil system that he implemented, and to what degree you would blame him for it or just say, well, that's, rotation in office is justified. It is up to each individual. And really right after he takes over and he's inaugurated, and just for context for those listening at this time, the federal government was pretty minuscule compared to what it is today. And most of the services provided through the government were done through state and local governments. Because of that, Congress didn't meet for very long. They just had one session each year, spent about half their time away from D.C. So because of the timing, anytime a new president was inaugurated, they sometimes had months to wrap their mind around how he was going to do his job prior to really having to haggle with Congress about any significant initiative. And so during this downtime, it seems, in 1829, a scandal broke out that pretty much took up a large majority of Andrew Jackson's attention and became sort of the hot button topic around Washington, D.C. And that is the Peggy Eaton scandal or the Petticoat Affair, whichever way you'd like to reference it. So if you could, Daniel, just give us some context around this situation specifically, what was going on and why was this a big deal?
Well, it's a big subject. Books have been written about it. And if you get into any Jackson biography, the Petticoat Affair takes up quite a bit of ink and paper. In fact, a lot of John Meacham's American Lion circles around the Petticoat Affair. There's an excellent book that I'll just mention right away, The Petticoat Affair, Manners, Mutiny, and Sex in Andrew Jackson's White House, by John Murlowski. It's an excellent book. So, I mean, and just even Jackson's earliest biographers after the Civil War, this scandal is on people's minds. So it's a big topic, but I'll do my best. The best place to start is honestly where you have started, which is Jackson winning the White House. But what's important about that context is that he's gained something, but he's also lost something. So Jackson wins the presidency. He's lost before in 1824 to the hands of John Quincy Adams. And what's important in that context is that he won the popular vote, but loses in the House of Representatives. And that's basically, long story cut short, that's where he finds his Democratic voice. And him and his allies and new allies come together to form the Democratic coalition that will take the White House by storm in 1828. Along the way, though, the mudslinging in that election gets absolutely horrific. And a particular target in that election is Jackson's wife, Rachel. There's a lot of scandal about this, but to keep it short, I know I've said that before, but to keep it brief, is that earlier in their lives, Jackson's wife, Rachel, had been married to another man, and they had fallen in love. It's a long story, but Jackson marries Rachel, and it's not quite clear if the divorce has been finalized. Well, it turns out it wasn't. So it turns out that Rachel and Andrew had been basically living in bigamy, which was a big sex scandal in itself, as you can imagine.
Big deal at this time.
Absolutely. So you can imagine this causes quite a lot of heartache. They try to rectify it. And they try to kind of just ease into it, hoping people will just go on none the wiser. Anyway, this gets dug up by Jackson's political enemies and is clearly used as a way to attack Jackson as someone who, without honor, married another man's wife, not very Christian, et cetera, et cetera. Well, beyond the Jackson, Rachel herself receives a lot of attacks in this. She's marred as like a loose woman, someone with ill repute, ungodly values, ungodly virtues. And this absolutely devastates Rachel. Rachel, is, combined with the psychological stresses that the campaign is happening, Rachel is also quite a sickly woman. Both of them were not in the top tip health of their lives, but eventually Rachel dies just as Jackson is winning the White House. So December 22nd, Rachel dies. And that, in a sense, sets up a lot of the mood of Jackson's presidency. Jackson takes the White House. He's inaugurated as president wearing all black, funeral kind of wear. So he's still in mourning when he arrives in the White House. Now, some of you might already be wondering, what the heck has this got to do with this Eaton woman? Well, I'll get into her a bit later, but the gist of it from Jackson's perspective is that a lot of the psychological trauma, or at least this is what a lot of historians have come to think, is that in losing Rachel, Peggy Eaton, Margaret Eaton, I should say. Peggy, I'll talk about Peggy that in a while. Margaret Eaton, also known as Peggy, she emerges kind of like a new Rachel, a woman who is attacked unfairly by Jackson's enemies, a woman who is is used as a ploy to get to Jackson and to get under his skin. So Jackson sees in the attacks on her, attacks on him, and beyond the grave, attacks on his wife. So we'll get into it, but I think that's kind of that's the foundational thing that's going on here.
Gotcha. Good. So you mentioned Margaret Eaton, or Peggy Eaton. Who is she, and how does she enter into the picture? And does this happen after Jackson becomes president, or does it all start during the campaign or before he became president for spill over or follow him to Washington, D.C.?
So Margaret Eaton, also known as Peggy, although some historians don't like to use the name Peggy because she didn't actually use it herself, and it may be a application used against her. I'm kind of on the fence about that. I don't know either way, but some scholars don't mind it. Anyway, Margaret Eaton. So she's the daughter of a owner of a boarding house and a tavern inside Washington, D.C. And it's important to know at this point that Washington, D.C. is barely getting over the fact that it's a swamp. We call it the swamp today, but at this point,
it was an actual literal swamp when they first built it.
Yeah, exactly. So Washington, D.C. isn't the most desirable place for people to live. But business is business, politics is politics. You got to go there. So as you can imagine, there are quite a few of these taverns and boarding houses all across the place. Well, Margaret happens to live in one of these, and her father, William, is the owner. And a lot of this we have to reconstruct from people's letters and diaries, and also later in her life, Margaret wrote a memoir herself. That in itself is its own interesting story. But it seems to be that she grew up around DC politics and DC gossip and just the movers and shakers of Washington life. So beyond the fact that she's interested in politics, she likes talking about politics. She's very striking. Even people who don't know her that well remark about her beauty. They'll make offhand comments about like how beautiful she is. So Jackson gets acquainted with her, I think, when she's a girl. I'm not. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure they meet when she's a girl and Jackson is serving for the first time as the representative of Tennessee. I'm pretty sure that's when they first meet, but it's not really a big deal at that point.
I believe that's accurate. Yeah.
Yeah. What becomes interesting is that she married. So basically, from becoming a woman, she starts to tend a bar as well. Now, a woman barkeeper isn't exactly unheard of, but as you can imagine, someone serving alcohol at this time period, being as beautiful as she is, starts to build up a reputation. Now, we can debate about this, and this is where things get really tricky for us as historians. How much of this is gossip? How much of this is accurate? And how much of this is just, reading between the lines where is this just men, trying to, as we would say today, quote unquote, slut shaming? So having said that, regardless, she builds up quite the reputation. Apparently some men try to marry her quite young already. I think she's solicited already by some naval guys. But eventually she marries this guy called John Timberlake, who is he's a naval officer. He's a purser for the United States Navy. He's quite a bit older than her. And he gets the reputation that A, he's a bit of a drinker, and B, he's not very good at money. But being in the Navy, he has to go away quite a bit. So as you can imagine, this causes quite a bit of rumor mongering that she starts to flirt or continues to flirt, whatever, with other people she keeps bar with. And there's all this anxiety about, oh, she's a married woman and she's a barkeeper and, you know, naughty. So all that reputation starts to build up around her. So, yeah.
So she's married to John Timberlake, and John Timberlake doesn't have any connection to Andrew Jackson. So how does Andrew Jackson get pulled into this? What happened with John Timberlake? I'm assuming he goes and somebody else steps in at some point. So
in the 18 teens, I think 1818 or 1817, John Eaton, no, it's 1818. Sorry, I just checked my notes. In 1818, John Eaton meets Peggy, and he's quite smitten by her. So Eaton at this time he's a widower, and he's already been he's just become the secretary. He's just become senator for Tennessee, and which is, you know, and he's a friend of Andrew Jackson.
Yeah.
So he's in Washington D.C. and he starts to get to, you know, like other politicians at the time. He starts tending this boarding house and starts to get to know her, and he's pretty much smitten. He learns about her financial troubles and things like that, and rumors immediately start to circulate. The big thing that happens is that Eaton it becomes quite clear that Eaton wants Peggy. He wants a married woman. And the big thing that we don't know about this for sure, but at least this is the rumors, is that Eaton and Margaret start having an affair, or at least that's what is implied. We don't know for sure if this was just flirtations and things like that, or if an affair did actually happen. Like all stuff behind closed doors with two people, it's really hard to tell.
Well, I assume, and sorry to interrupt, but I assume at this time it was a bad look in general for a man to even flirt, like openly and continuously flirt with a married woman and make it clear to, you know, optically at least that he desired her. So I wouldn't be surprised if, even if they weren't having an affair, maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but even if they weren't, if people just jump to that conclusion, because it's not really a great look to be flirting that heavily, potentially, with a married woman as it is.
Well, it's difficult. Like in our own age, there's a fine line between being flirty and like, oh, he's quite charming. Yeah. You're like, oh my God, is this guy hitting on me? You know, it's difficult. Henry Clay, for example, Henry Clay has a reputation as a flirt and a bit of a ladies' man, and that he's, you know, quite charming, but he never builds up the same sort of reputation. Mm-hmm. Also, it's interesting that a lot of the scandal circulates around Margaret, not John, which clearly tells us a lot about the gender politics in this era. That you know, the guy being a bit of a flirt is one thing, but a loose woman, holy hell, that's not great. But eventually, these rumors start to circulate, and the rumors get back to Timberlake. And Timberlake, who is at sea at this point, he either gets involved in an accident or he kills himself. And again, rumors build on top of rumors. The rumor builds that he kills himself because of Margaret's affair. With him out of the way, that leaves Eaton open to marry her. And Jackson actually encourages the marriage. Jackson was always a bit of a romantic. But Jackson, what's interesting is Jackson, I don't think I've ever seen a Jackson letter where he doesn't encourage someone to get married. He encourages James K. Polk to marry Sarah Polk. He encourages John Eaton. So yeah, like Jackson's very pro-marriage.
Well, I think that's interesting because, and so John Eaton's really close with Andrew Jackson and had been for a long time up to this point.
Well, I should also mention Eaton is one of Jackson's lieutenants. Eaton had written a campaign biography about Andrew Jackson that is very, to say that it is hagiographical, like it's Saint Andy, so it's very, these guys are tight. These guys are very tight.
But it would also make sense when you think about, and I talked about an episode, I'm going off the top of my head, I believe it was episode 119, and you rehashed a bit of it here at the very beginning of our conversation in the history between Rachel and Andrew, and how much heat Jackson took, and how much shaming there was on both he and Rachel throughout their relationship, and how much enmity that must have built up for him in the idea of, like, if don't throw stones if you don't live in a glass house, and how frustrated he must have become at people jumping to conclusions and spreading rumors about him and Rachel throughout the first 5 to 10 years of their relationship. And then, of course, the culmination of those things during the campaign of 1828. And I would think that he would be able to at least see some type of commonality when he's talking to John, who he goes way back with and he's very close with. And John is talking about how he maybe is having second thoughts on marrying Margaret because of what other people are saying, or other people were accusing him of being responsible. Not only did he have an affair with a married woman, but now he's basically an accomplice to a homicide, right? Because if he had never stepped into, I'm sure some people were saying if he had never stepped into the picture, Timberlake would have never killed himself, or would have never died, or, his horribly disreputable behavior destroyed Timberlake emotionally, and that's why he killed himself. So he's having, like, as you mentioned, rumor on top of rumor, and he's feeling all of this, and so he goes to Jackson for counsel, and Jackson's probably thinking, hell, I've been through this. like I know what this feels like. But to a certain extent, or am I way off?
No, I think you're on the right path. The key thing is that Jackson doesn't believe the rumors. In fact, Jackson, like, just as to jump the gun a little bit, Jackson will eventually say about Margaret, she's as pure as the Virgin Mary. She's as chaste as the Virgin Mary, which, not to get gossipy, but, like, that's a lot of people. That's
a pretty bold statement.
Well, right. Like, even some people who are pro Margaret are like, like that, like, come on, man, let's be real. But that's the interesting thing, is that Jackson sees a lot of Rachel in this whole scandal, but one of the things he sees is Margaret's innocence. Now, and this is where it gets complicated. What was this? She had built up such a reputation as a bit of a flirt and maybe even adulteress, but Jackson is just oblivious to, like, oh, it's all rumor, it's all lies, like not Margaret, like, Margaret's a good girl. So it's in terms of that fine line between, like, flirtation and charm, Jackson kind of is oblivious to all of it in some way. He doesn't see any of that when it comes to Margaret. She's just a fine, pure young lady, and everything that's been said about her is gossip mongering and slings and arrows against him and her and against John, his right-hand man. So what's interesting is that Jackson takes it to the other extreme, where Jackson's opponents are like, yeah, this woman is like a harlot. Jackson's like, no, she's as pure as the Virgin Mary. So
yeah, which doesn't help things, and when two people retreat to their corners, that just makes them dig in even further and further. So Jackson makes John Eaton his Secretary of War, and after he makes John Eaton his Secretary of War, from my understanding, the rumors start to pick up a bit more about Margaret and John, because now John is officially in Jackson's cabinet, and of course everyone within, especially when the cabinets were so small back then, people within the cabinet were a direct reflection of the president himself, or the character of the president himself. And so the rumors begin to pick up about Margaret and about John. And what is sort of the next shoe to drop here with how it escalates even further than just rumor mongering?
Well, one of the things that kind of trips the football to begin with is that they only get married 9 months after her first husband died, which
Not a good
typically,
look.
no, it's not a good look. Typically, I believe at that stage, you're meant to wait. I think it's about 2 years, maybe 3. Men, it's a bit different, but in a woman's case, you're meant to be in mourning. And it's in stark contrast. Jackson, as I said before, is in all black mourning Rachel, and Margaret's already moving on.
So that's well, I guess you could draw from that, right? If the assumption is socially that it's appropriate to mourn for 2 to 3 years after your husband dies, and that's assuming, of course, that you really love your husband and have been faithful to your husband and are heartbroken over it, then if there were already rumors of John and Margaret having this relationship and potentially an affair, then when Timberlake dies and they marry 9 months later, to those who believed that an affair was going on in the first place, to them that probably just validates that, see, I told you, look how quickly she married him. There had to have been something
it doesn't help their case, to say the least. And that's kind of the context, because the case for them to be accepted is already on shaky ground. That's where it gets really difficult. So it's important to understand for your listeners how a lot of these politics around Washington work. You would go and receive people, you would be received, and really there is a politics of relationships that you would pay attention and visit people. Women in particular, it was unexpected, would be received by men and would be welcomed for tea, or they would listen, things like that. It's the women would receive one another, and all of this is these kind of familial networks, which helps bring. And you can imagine the backdrop that's around this. There is political alliances at play. There are friendships being formed. There are coalitions that are being built around all this stuff. So we might see it like, look, it's. Isn't this just a social call? No, it's never just a social call. So there's all these dynamics at play. What makes things complicated is it's quite easy to be received by someone because of manners and honor. So even if you don't really like the person that much, you would receive them into your house. May not spend a lot of time with them. You may try to make an excuse to get rid of them, but you would receive them and pay the deference that's due a guest of your house. What's more complicated is if nobody comes to visit you. That's not a good sign. If no one is coming to visit you, the problem's with you. So, that is part of the problem that starts to build up, is that very few people come to visit the Eatons. And Margaret starts to get more and more shunned by Washington society. So to begin with, people, she's allowed to pay visits to people and things like that. But as you can imagine, when no one is coming to visit her, she's not invited to balls, she's not invited to outings and things like that with the other ladies. Nobody wants her calling card, for example. That you can imagine, the situation becomes very tense and very stressful for Margaret, because this is what's expected of a lady of Washington.
Yeah, that must have been really challenging for her. And I feel like at this point, that type of ostracism is even more apparent and at times even more petty. So you have this small city, if you can call it that, in Washington, D.C. And of course, you have Andrew Jackson, who does not have a first lady. Right. Mm-hmm. So and his niece was sort of the hostess of the White House at this time. And so then when you think about like the upper crust of the influential women in Washington, D.C., those would be the wives of the members of the cabinet. Margaret, you would assume, would be one of those influential women who would be looked upon very highly. by Washington elite and the Washington common man and woman. And people would really desire to spend time with her, to be part of her network, to be part of the influence that she could have, especially knowing how close her husband was with the president of the United States and how she had known Andrew Jackson for, maybe a couple decades at this point. So I would think that the lack of visitors and the lack of guests, the lack of invitations was becoming even more obvious to everyone, that it almost seemed like they were boycotting spending time with Margaret.
Absolutely. And that becomes very clear early on that is what's going on. What's fascinating, though, what makes it even more complicated is when you add the Calhouns into the mix. So the Calhouns, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina is Andrew Jackson's vice president. Like I said before, Calhoun is one of those interesting guys who goes from political rival to political ally and then becomes a different kind of political foe to Jackson.
He made one of the greatest career plays ever. He went from vice president of John Quincy Adams to vice president of Andrew Jackson. That's pretty brilliant move. That's hard to pull off.
It is, yeah. And yes, only vice president to serve under two different people, I believe. I'm pretty sure that's right. Yeah.
And two direct competitors at that.
Yes. So, and Calhoun's an interesting cat, to say the least. But so Calhoun's wife is probably one of the most important women in Washington. Yeah, being the wife of the vice president, she is one of the most important ladies in Washington.
And at this point, she had been the wife of the vice president for going on 5 years now. So that equity in Washington had been building up for years at this point. And since there's no first lady, she, I would think, almost fills that de facto role to some extent in the eyes of some.
But not only that, she also has her reputation is completely different to Margaret's. She comes from a much more genteel Southern society, and women weren't educated to the same degree as men, but I believe she had gone to a reading school, so she had some sort of education. Margaret never experienced any of that kind of social high life that she did. So, even without the sexual scandal hanging over, the two of them come from very different worlds. Gotcha. But basically, once the Calhouns start to get involved in the shunning of Margaret Eden, that's when Jackson really starts to rise up and take this personally.
Why do you think that is?
A few reasons. I think Jackson is incredibly paranoid, and I'm not saying that to cast him off as, he's just crazy. Jackson was the type of person who saw enemies around any corner, and coming from the electoral experience, he understands quote unquote betrayal, because he had won the popular vote, but then the House of Representatives had quote unquote betrayed him. There are political allies who will become political foes. For example, this hasn't happened yet, but Nicholas Biddle was originally a Jackson ally, but with the bank war unrolling, Biddle will become a bitter foe. John Quincy Adams was originally a fan of Jackson and supported Jackson's activity in Florida with his invasion. Later, John Quincy Adams even considered Jackson as a running mate for VP. But later, he will curse his name to the ends of time. He was never friends with Henry Clay. He always hated Henry Clay. But so you can already see Jackson kind of has this built in the cake paranoia when it comes to this. Beyond that, like I've said before, he sees in this, he thinks the rumors about them are baseless. So he sees this as one trying to bring down a woman of good virtue and make her into one of ill repute wrongly, like they did to Rachel. But beyond that, because it involves so many cabinet members of his administration, he basically sees that knives out are out for him. So he like in many things, Jackson internalizes and personalizes this. So the attacks on her are secretly about him. And it might sound a bit egotistical that Jackson makes it all about him, but, well, He does. He makes it about him.
Yeah, that's sort of a common theme. And I would also think that based on his 1824 experience and then the campaign of 1828 and the mudslinging there and how many political opponents he saw, hiding behind every bush, he probably some of that paranoia when he could not. So you mentioned the Calhouns get involved, and John's wife is probably the leader of this ostracism of Margaret. And that type of talk spills over into informal cabinet conversations. And now this type of gossip and rumor mongering that, as you mentioned, Jackson 100% believes is not true, is starting to bleed into his presidency and his day-to-day activities. And I would have to think it began to drive him a bit crazy.
Probably, but it's also like it derails so much. One of the things historians comment about the Eaton Affair is just how it derails the Jackson administration to begin with. The only thing they really start to get in the works is Indian removal. That's the first thing on Jackson's mind. Everything else, Jackson's campaign promise is very vague. His campaign promise is Jackson and reform. Well, what does reform mean? Mm-hmm. Well, you've talked a little bit about the spoil systems, but there's all these other things he has in mind. And a lot of it just doesn't really come to fruition. And you can kind of see there are many ways it gets derailed because people start to get coalitions start to form. And are you pro Margaret or are you against Margaret? And you can imagine, John and Margaret are coming around. And you want to talk politics, but you want to talk business, but your wife isn't a big fan of Margaret, and you're worried how this is going to have a blowback on you. So that causes a cog in the wheel. So there are real ripple effects to this.
Yeah, and I would have to think that the men themselves, almost through the pressure that they were feeling on the home front, were almost forced. In so many ways to pick a side. Either you're with me or you're with John and Margaret. And of course the men were like, okay, well, I have to be with you. You're my wife. And if you say that she is an immoral flirt who we shouldn't be seen around, then okay, we won't be seen around her. You don't have to visit her. I won't go to parties with you where she is. And of course, all of this builds up and builds up. What type of impact did this have on the cabinet itself? Because, I mean, this type of tension rising can only last for so long.
Well, I mean, eventually the climax is that it ends with the entire cabinet retiring. That's the real, I mean, spoiler alert. There's a lot of things happen in the process, but that's basically where it goes. And there are also other things going on at the same time because the Tariff of Abominations is also happening at the same time, which I'm sure you'll get into on another episode. Or
next episode. Yep. So
you can imagine these things are congruent with one another, that they're trying to deal with the stress being allied on them with this tariff issue, and the wives and the husbands are not on good terms with one another. What's interesting is that probably the person who succeeds the most, you mentioned before, is Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren does very well by going on Team Margaret. He's a widower at the time, which, I think it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that if Van Buren had been married or his wife was still alive, maybe this would have turned out different. But because Van Buren is a free agent and a widower, he avails himself to Margaret. But not only that, but he really starts to back Jackson. That's where he already. So to backtrack a little bit, Van Buren originally was a supporter of William Crawford in the election of 24. He starts to see the way the wind is blowing, and he starts to form an alliance. In fact, really, the Democratic Party, as we know it today, is the brainchild of Martin Van Buren. He's the one who conceives of the alliance that will become the backbone and the powerhouse that is the Democratic Party. And throughout it, in supporting her, Jackson makes him his new vice president once John C. Calhoun retires.
Yeah, and going back to those social pressures I was mentioning at home, and you bring up that Martin Van Buren is a widower. He wasn't having to deal with them. He wasn't having to go home and answer to a wife who may have been upset with him for siding with John and Peggy. And from my understanding, Martin Van Buren and John Eaton saw the division within the cabinet. And by the way, you mentioned the Tariff of Abominations and the nullification crisis, which we'll get more into next week and the following week. So Calhoun is publicly at odds with Jackson over politics. And then in the background, his wife is spreading these slanderous rumors potentially about one of Jackson's best friend's wives. And so I can sort of understand Jackson's paranoia. But anyway, back to Van Buren. It seems like, he's nicknamed the Little Magician for a reason. I mean, the guy sees every angle, and he's always thinking politics, politics, politics. And, no one will ever know for sure, but likely he saw, as you mentioned, switching from Crawford to Jackson, he saw which way the wind was blowing. Here, he probably figured President Jackson's never coming off this stance that Margaret is pure and Margaret is innocent of all of these things. It's never going to happen. The guy's going to go to his grave believing it, whether it's true or not. And so it's probably better for me to jump on Team Jackson and Team Eaton earlier rather than later. And from my understanding, Martin Van Buren and John Eaton basically they volunteered to resign themselves from the cabinet so they could remove the drama that was going on, which of course would be seen from Jackson as a very selfless act. And that just made Jackson want to defend them even more. And now there's a very clear line being drawn. It's such a brilliant political play because now Martin Van Buren is throwing into the mix the possibility that resignation from the cabinet could end all of this. So once he and Eaton say, well, we'll resign, then Jackson probably like, well, hell no. Everybody else should resign. You two are the only two that see it my way and are defending me. Why would you resign? It should be the opposite. Everyone else should resign and you two should stay.
Yeah, what's interesting about Van Buren, though, is that Van Buren is quite clear, I think, that he's a bit of a realist. He, in his correspondence and in his writings, he does seem to know, he winks and acknowledges Margaret's reputation, where Jackson is clueless, in denial, or just really like, I don't know how to put it. Like whether he's clueless in denial or he just firmly believes this, he never even suggests the opposite. Van Buren seems to know that Margaret probably has a history. The difference is that he probably just doesn't hold it against her all that much, and also, again, he knows Jackson's the president, so this is where the power is.
Yeah. So the rest of the cabinet more or less resign. Van Buren is installed as vice president, and Eaton is sent down to be governor of Florida, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then I believe he becomes minister of Spain at some point, but yes. Eaton and Jackson's relationship, they have a bit of a falling out also over the long term. Is that correct? I feel like Eaton enjoyed being governor of Florida just as much as Andrew Jackson did, which was not very much.
Well, what's painful for Jackson at this point is that he loses, for a time, a lot of close people. So we mentioned them before, the Donaldsons. The Donaldsons are basically, they are Rachel's brother. So Andrew Jackson Donaldson is Rachel's brother's son, I think.
Yeah. So yes, Andrew's nephew. Yes.
Yeah. And they're basically adopted children. Jackson is particularly fond of Emily, who, as you rightly point out, is basically the first lady for all intents and purposes. She's at least the hostess. And she doesn't really like the Eatons all that much, or she doesn't like Margaret all this much. So you can imagine that Jackson's own family is being torn apart by this. Eaton, one of his right-hand men, is being torn apart by this. So, Jackson feels very, very isolated in this period. So, yeah, this whole enterprise causes a lot of heartbreak for the Jackson administration. Chief among them, probably Margaret, but second, Andrew Jackson himself.
So when you take a step back and look at this, we're talking about a marriage between I don't want to call him a propagandist. I think that's not fair to John Eaton, but a good friend of Jackson and a man who helped Jackson become president. And if you want to take it as far as him being a propagandist, that's fine. A marriage between him and a female bartender has now caused Andrew Jackson to become totally distracted from his goals of being president of the United States. It has caused him to replace his vice president. His beloved niece and nephew are no longer associating with him. His nephew's no longer working for him. Emily's no longer living at the White House. John, because everything got so crazy, he sent John down to Florida just because he couldn't deal with the drama anymore. And the entire cabinet has been replaced. Is that a accurate summation of the impact of this marriage between John and Margaret?
More or less. The key thing I would add is that it's never, like most things, like most sex scandals, it's rarely just about the sex.
Yep.
There's always layers upon layers that relate to other things and other angles. So, Van Buren rising to the occasion. He probably, we do know that he had affection for Margaret and he liked her, but he probably saw an opening to help solidify his alliance. Calhoun, I'm sure, was very did not like Margaret all that much. But him and Jackson had already been off to a rough shake to begin with. This was just another pillar in their breakdown, so to speak, another injury to their breakdown. This speaks so. What I find really fascinating is that it tells us so much about political life, about gender politics, about the Jackson administration, about Jackson himself. There's so many ways to read the Eaton scandal. So on the one hand, on the superficial level, it kind of has this soap opera gossip to it, like kind of like an episode of a bad Days of Our Lives. But when you dig deeper, you realize just how deep a lot of this stuff goes. And with the religion angle, if I can add in here, a lot of ministers who had supported Jackson, who had spent a long time trying to smooth over Jackson's rough edges to present him as a godly candidate. As you can imagine, so one of them is Ezra Stiles Alley. He is horrified by the Petticoat Affair, and he basically backs Jackson as a godly candidate, and Jackson is supporting this person who he sees as basically a whore and a harlot. And Jackson tells this minister that he's basically Judas, that he's like a Pharisee. Yeah.
So, wow. So when we look back, and you've clearly studied the Petticoat Affair in great detail, far more than myself. When you look back and you think about the Petticoat Affair, when you read through this and you understand this, you mentioned, how politics worked at the time, the sort of how high society in Washington, D.C. operated, the gender politics at the time. We're right in the middle of Jackson and his presidency. And for some people listening to the podcast, they really didn't know much about Jackson prior to me introducing him to, onto the political scene for the election of 1824, actually, but during his wars down in Florida prior to that. But what does examining all of this and studying the Petticoat Affair, what does this tell us about Jackson? How does this just remind us how much different he is and is going to continue to be than the presidents and even some of the other politicians that came before him?
So it tells us quite a bit about Jackson, some ways in which he's unique and some ways that he's not so unique. To start with the not so unique, Jackson, if your listeners are interested, if you're interested in a book, Mark Cheatham's Andrew Jackson Southerner is an excellent Southern biography. Often we think of Jackson as a Westerner, and while that's true to some extent, Jackson was raised in Southern culture. And one of the things of Southern culture he was raised in is honor culture. And a part of Southern honor was protecting womanly virtue, protecting womanly honor. So compared to other candidates, now granted, other candidates would have definitely, with the gender politics of the time, wanted to protect womanly virtue, of course, but with his Southern identity, I think that arises. In the campaign literature, Jackson is promoted as a defender of womanly virtue and defender of the ladies. So I think that plays in it for one. It's different, though, because of Jackson's relationship with Rachel, the way he internalizes it so much that he sees this attack on them as an attack on him. Now, presidents have always, in my opinion, presidents personalize a lot of attacks. But what's different compared to, say, a president, I'm trying to think of an example from recent times, but I can't, who you could easily see someone being fired over this. Like an awkward gossip starts to emerge, and it's like, well, you should do what's best for the party and bow out. Jackson doesn't do that. He sticks to his guns for the Eaton's innocence and purity day in, day out. So there's that element as well, which is, I think, quite striking in terms of modern politics. The final thing I think this tells us about Jackson is that Jackson doesn't want to back down from a fight. And I mean that in two ways. One, he refused to let his enemies win. And he saw a lot of people as his enemies. But beyond that, we often see Jackson as a kind of brutish, maybe even psychopathic idiot, a bloodthirsty genocide monger. And I think the more you study the Petticoat Affair, the more you see him as a political animal, someone who likes the game, he can see the angles. And even though some of the angles are a bit conspiratorial and paranoid, Jackson is a creature of politics. It's not, Van Buren may be the little magician, but Jackson ain't too shabby himself when it comes to the politics.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, especially the all three of them. But that third point in particular, and I love how you said that he won't back down from the fight, or he's looking for a fight. Because when I think about the Petticoat Affair, and this is right at the beginning of his 8 years in office, I almost think like, here is the harbinger of things to come, right? I mean, this guy doubled down and fought and fought and fought, replaced his entire cabinet, replaced his vice president over a marriage between John and Margaret Eaton. And he is going to take that same type of almost binary perspective of there's a winner and there's a loser in this political debate. And damn it, I'm going to be the winner. And he's going to bring it to the debate on the nullification crisis. And, he's going to fight John Marshall over Indian removal. And he's going to fight, as you mentioned, a former friend, Nicholas. And you can say former friend for a lot of people in Andrew Jackson's political career. Former friend Nicholas Biddle over the bank war. And it's like every huge issue in his presidency or initiative that gets pushback becomes a fight. And one of the things I love about Jackson, and I mentioned it either last episode or the episode before, is that I love how when he decided he was going to do something or he was right about something, he did not let other people's opinions stray him from his ultimate goal in achieving it. And I think that to a certain extent is a very admirable quality that people have. I think a lot of people spend way too much time thinking about what other people think about what they think about. And Jackson seemed to be, he could keep his eye on the ball and keep moving forward no matter what people said. But the problem is that I think you're right. He really enjoyed it to a certain extent when he could pick a fight and he could just keep fighting. And it was how he identified himself. I mean, this is a president who shot people. He was in duels, right? He had a bullet lodged in his chest. And so he liked the fight. And I think that he got a lot of emotional satisfaction from seeking out the fight, finding it, and then winning the fight.
There is a recollection from when Jackson starts to become popular, they start to interview childhood friends and things like that. And there's a story about him wrestling with boys, and the friend recollects that I could never keep Andy down. I could throw him down, but I could never keep Andy down. And I think that there is a bit of spirit in that. Tell me something, Chris. Did you tell your listeners Andrew Jackson's mother's final piece of advice to her son?
I did not, but I would love it if you did.
So Jackson, this is from Jackson's recollection. And this is basically his mother's final words to him, more or less, or at least how he remembers it. Andrew, if I should not see you again, I wish you to remember and treasure up some things that I've already said to you. In this world, you will have to make your own way. To do that, you must have friends. You can make friends by being honest, and if you keep them, being steadfast. You must keep in mind that friends worth having will, in the long run, expect as much from you as you give to them. For an obligation or to be ungrateful for a kindness is a base crime, not merely a fault or a sin, but an actual crime. Men guilty of it, sooner or later, must suffer the penalty. In personal conduct, be polite, but never obsequious. None will respect you more than you respect yourself. Avoid quarrels as long as you can without yielding to imposition, but sustain your manhood always. Never bring a suit of law for assault or battery or defamation. The law affords no remedy for such outrage that can satisfy the true feelings of a true man. Never wound the feelings of another. Never broke warrant or outrage upon your feelings. If you ever have to vindicate your feelings or defend your honor, do it calmly. If angry at first, wait until your wrath cools before you proceed. I think that. If you want a psychic key into Jackson, I think that sums up a lot of it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think
so. Whether Jackson is misremembering it, or he's putting into words what he thought his mother said, or his mother actually said it. Either way, I think that you could apply a lot of that stuff to the Eaton affair, about friends, about manhood, about honor, about defamation, and about, taking, sustaining your honor. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and like you mentioned, whether that was verbatim what she said or how he remembered it, how he remembers it is all that matters, because the message was being delivered to him. And the only thing that matters in a message is how the message is interpreted by the person it's being delivered to, right? We've all found that out in life when our messages have been misinterpreted, and then we find out where the real power in the message lies. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. I learned a ton on this episode. I love bringing on people like yourself, fellow U.S. history podcasters who your depth of knowledge in the Jackson era is evident. I'm sure all my listeners will agree. And so please tell them where they can find you, how they can interact with you on Twitter or whatever it is. Get all your plugs in, because I know they'll enjoy listening to you and enjoy interacting with you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for having me on. Thank you so much for your listeners for putting up with my rambling up to this point. It's a treat to talk to someone besides my poor wife about my obsessions. But if you're interested in history and religion and politics, I talk about that a lot on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter at Daniel Gullotta, Gullotta. You can also check out my work and research and articles I've written in op-eds at danielngullotta.com. And the Age of Jackson podcast can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcast needs met. If you want to talk to me about history, about religion in the Jacksonian period, if you want book recommendations, feel free to contact me on my website or shout out on Twitter. Or if you have a question about menswear, I love menswear. So my colleague Craig Bruce Smith and I will be we will happily tell you what goes with loafers and what doesn't.
Sounds good. I may be leaning on your counsel there.
Oh, great, fantastic.
Menswear is not my forte. Well, Daniel, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And those of you who are listening in, thanks for listening. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.